Vaughan would always say, you can design a fantastic record cover, but if it doesn't relate to the sound and the content, then it's a waste of time.
He just looked at the ugly side of things or the beautiful side of things as a sort of counterpoint to whatever the music was like.
The way he could weave his very offbeat, very visceral, very dark references is wonderful. Vaughan was a visual poet.
The British graphic designer Vaughan Oliver was a towering genius. Brutally honest and deeply passionate, he was passionate about football, Samuel Beckett, art and film, and he was passionate about his family too. He was also passionate about the countless artists and musicians he helped to personify.
Vaughan was completely key to 4AD, and Ivo has talked at great length about how the records, they were artifacts, and the artwork was very much a part of that.
And to many, a messiah.
Vaughan occupied his own planet, and 23 Envelope was a cult. Just one of the most powerful influences I've ever had.
Above all, he was a singular visionary whose ideas and philosophical approach to art and design have not been matched since. He possessed a cerebral intellect, perverse Vic and Bob Stanley Unwin-like dark sense of humour, as well as a reverence for the beauty found in blemishes and sublime visual poetry. He was someone who, for Chris Bigg, that could be both charming and almost impenetrable all at the same time.
Really shy, but really outgoing. Very complicated. Possibly the funniest person I've ever known. He was hilarious.
Tragically, in December 2019, Vaughan Oliver died at the age of 62. Author and designer Adrian Shaughnessy, who was one of Vaughan's closest confidants, paints a portrait of someone who lived life to the full.
He lived a pretty rock and roll life, actually, for quite a long time. Then he met Lee, and I think Lee saved him. And it's just so tragic that he then died so suddenly.
At his funeral, in his eulogy, designer Graham Wood spoke of the exact moment he saw Vaughan's work for the first time, a moment that would sear an indelible imprint on his brain forever. He'd seen the Cocteau Twins perform on TV and was enamored by Elizabeth Fraser's mesmerizing voice and presence.
I'd seen them perform on the BBC, I can't remember what show, and it had to have been a Sunday night, because I remember going sort of into school the next morning, then leaving school and going to a record shop and seeing this cover. It was almost like not being able to see something, sort of seeing, don't understand this, it's making my mind buzz.
For a moment, he stood staring at the sleeve of the band's song, Pearly Dewdrops Drops, a drifting melody layered in acoustic ambiguity. For Graham Wood, something ignited in him that day.
That sense of looking at things, that slipping, glimpsing thing, that textural thing, just looking for the sort of weird in the everyday, or looking for the texture on the pavement, looking for the mystery and the magic.
The record cover was rich in texture, multi-layered in visual poetry. It was a lush distillation of a song that filled your imagination with both joy and fantasy. Trembling with excitement, he walked out and raced home to replay what he saw in his head over and over again. In reciting from Vaughan's eulogy, Graham Wood describes how this experience was almost mythical.
I felt I'd had an intimation of the alchemical means to be able to make something from nothing. Beyond inspiration, a visceral exchange had taken place, a change of state, solid to liquid, into air.
It was a moment of pure inspiration, a moment of cerebral reconfiguration. It was a moment that also inspired Wood to forge a path for himself when he formed his own agency, Tomato, straight out of college in 1991, reciting again from his eulogy.
Vaughan is the main reason I do what I do. The first time I came across Vaughan's work, it felt like my vision was slipping. A peripheral glimpse of shimmering light, something oily and decaying, transcendent. I didn't know what I was seeing or how to see it. This was a deeply profound experience.
For Wood and scores of Vaughan's disciples, moments like these were deeply profound, like for designer Jonathan Barnbrook.
I remember seeing a poster on the way to college for Fever by Exmal Deutschland. I remember seeing that and just almost wanted to kneel down and worship it. It was such a perfect relationship, image and text and expression of the music.
They were otherworldly experiences, a slipping glimpse, as Wood recalled Vaughan liked to say. Graham Wood's poignant eulogy painted a portrait of someone determined to see the world his way. A man born from the working-class grit of Newcastle who tumbled headfirst into a world of sonic outsiders and nonconformist dreamers. A world that eventually allowed him to have the creative freedom he always yearned for. In 1982, he stumbled through the door at record label 4AD and never looked back. In archival audio from a documentary filmed in 1984, Oliver explains why his time at 4AD was so important.
I couldn't work for another record sleeve design company. I couldn't work for another record company. I couldn't be an art director in a company. Other than this, I'd buy Cocteau Twins records, Colourbox records. I like the idea of having them in my house against the wall with my rendition, my visual rendition of that music inside of them. It is as personal as that.
But throughout his life, Oliver's work was never just about design. It was also about immersing yourself in an abstract world filled with intricate, arcane delights. He liked to say it was all about expressing the mystery and the ambiguity, painting a picture of something invisible, something that could only be felt in your heart and your mind. For 4AD founder Ivo Watts-Russell, it was simpler. I like the idea of the sleeve seducing you into its world, he once said in an interview. Hey there, sorry for the interruption, but if you're enjoying the show, please support us on Patreon or follow us on Instagram at Destroy Punk Podcast. Now back to the show. This episode of Destroy is the story of Vaughan Oliver, a soft-spoken creative revolutionary who one day made his way from County Durham in northern England to the gritty suburbs of southwest London and redefined the visual landscape of music forever. It's a story about a prolific designer who never chased financial prosperity or the traditional path to success. He simply chased his imagination, the burning desire to turn record sleeves into semiotic symbols of myth steeped in joy and exuberance, to create powerful, enigmatic, and emotional visual languages for bands and artists that have not been matched in music's history since. It's a story about someone who, over 4 decades, helped shape the personas of bands like Pixies, Cocteau Twins, Exmal Deutschland, This Mortal Coil, and countless more. Someone whose sleeves weren't just a piece of packaging, they were portals. Like Beckett, they were riddles, invitations to explore your mind.
Perhaps my best years are gone, when there was a chance of having. But I wouldn't want them back. Not with the fire in me now. No, I wouldn't want them back.
And when Oliver died on December 29, 2019, the sense of loss echoed not just among his family, but throughout the entire creative community. Among those gathered at his funeral were former students, longtime collaborators, and artists who loved him, people whose lives had been transformed by his work, touched by his presence. One of them, artist and designer Paul West, upon reflection, summarized it all.
Going to his funeral was such an incredible thing. That all the old faces there, the people that you'd seen along the way, managers, bands. And the wonderful thing about Vaughan, of course, was there was the man, the myth, the designer, but it was also the caring husband, the father who was at his son's every single football match, and his best friend from school giving a eulogy in tears. And that's when you see the measure of the man. You just realize how many facets Vaughan had to him. He was just such a caring, doting individual, and that never ever went away. And that's how I remember him. He was just very nurturing.
In this special episode of Destroy, we hear from many more of the people who worked beside Vaughan Oliver, were taught by him, were challenged by him, and were also moved by him. We hear from many of those who loved him, who felt indebted to his passion. Lush vocalist Mickey Berenyi, Cocteau Twins bass player Simon Raymond, and designer Jonathan Barnbrook, as well as his longtime creative partner, Chris Bigg. In archival audio, we also hear the voices of Nigel Grierson, Ivor Watts Russell, and Oliver too. We return to the beginning to understand how one man redefined the way music could look and feel. We unravel Oliver's last tape and rewind. My name is Richard Smith, and I'm your host. I too was a fan of Vaughan Oliver and his work at 4AD, and I too received the benefit of his generosity when I still was at college, trying to navigate the art of design. This special episode is a testament to Vaughan Oliver's creativity, his influence, and his legacy. Welcome to Destroy.
They are punk rockers.
Raw, outrageous and crude.
The new craze, they tell me.
More into chaos than anything else.
People really don't understand what kids want.
Worthless, nasty.
They're a hero.
You have to destroy in order to create.
Destroy is produced by Be Right Back Studios. Visit berightbackstudios.com/destroy to learn more. If you're enjoying the show, visit our website, destroypunkpodcast.com, to learn more about every episode, including interview transcripts, show notes, music videos, curated playlists, and more. Thank you for listening.
Are you sitting comfortable 2 square on your body? Then we'll begin.
The comedic actor Stanley Unwin loved word games, often creating oral concoctions of banal idiosyncrasies that often played games with your brain. They made you wonder, and much like the work of Vaughan Oliver, they made you think, and sometimes think twice. Born on September 12, 1957, Vaughan Oliver grew up in Newton Aycliffe, County Durham, a new town built by the British government in the wake of the Second World War. It was an experiment to rehouse working families in tidy red brick blocks. It was a way to compartmentalize the masses in neat, controlled order. It was dull, uniform, linear. The sky was a constant shade of grey, and there were rows and rows of council houses with grim views of smokestacks billowing out pollution far off in the distance. It was not a place known for beauty, let alone revolution or art. There were no galleries in Newton Aycliffe, no idealist in the fields of steel and ore, no masters of reinvention. For Oliver, it was a place devoid of inspiration. He described it as having no real culture, and that his parents weren't interested in anything unusual either. Everything he got was through record sleeves. For him, he said, it was a way of discovering art. Yet, despite its lack of stimulation, it was a heritage he was proud of, as author and designer Adrian Shaughnessy explains.
He came from incredibly modest backgrounds. He lived in a little village surrounded by the northeast of England. His father was an electrician, and he was very attached to his location where he grew up.
His upbringing might have been confined by conformity, but it never impacted his imagination. In an interview reflecting on his childhood, Oliver once said, "I was a working class lad from a dull town. The local record shop was an art gallery for me." The dishevelled vinyl section at his local Woolworths was a haven for the youthful Oliver. Its cramped interior was stacked with racks of album sleeves, simple 12-inch squares filled with possibility, clues to something richer, stranger, more alive. For him, they weren't just products on a shelf. They were guides to a promised land that would one day set his imagination free. Weekend after weekend, he would tramp down the high street through the pelting rain and spend hours flipping through the stacks of records, poring over sleeves by Hypnosis, new releases from Factory and Rough Trade, as well as albums designed by his hero, the illustrator Roger Dean. But he didn't just look, he absorbed. He engulfed himself in the symbolic messages, the obscure visual references. A cow, a man on fire, a stark black and white pulsar, an exotic, multicolored fantasy, a tangerine dream. It was heaven, and he was getting addicted. At Ferry Hill Comprehensive, his town's co-ed secondary school located on Merrington Road, he met a kindred spirit by the name of Nigel Grierson. Grierson, another lanky, scruffy teenage upstart, was also spellbound by the intoxicating nature of the record sleeve and dreamt of a way out of the stifling boredom through their surreal pictures and visceral sounds. Grierson and Oliver inevitably became inseparable, two obsessive dreamers, restless L.S. Lowry-like matchstick men in cloth hats and working-class boots, both driven by the same curiosity, the same sense that something important was happening out there and they wanted in. Together, they found themselves at Newcastle Polytechnic 1 year apart, both under the spell of the enigmatic artist and illustrator Terry Dowling. Dowling, a design educator who cared little for Joseph Muller-Brockman's Helvetica-inspired modernism and perfectly aligned grids, was simply there to awaken their instinct. His mantra was even more powerful: to suggest is to create, to describe is to destroy. For designer and former V23 collaborator Tim O'Donnell, it was a mantra that Oliver lived by.
That's like the perfect encapsulation of all of it, right? It's like you don't want to describe it and take away all of the room for the viewer to bring their own experience to it. So you just give some cues and let them bring their own thoughts to it.
It was also Dowling who introduced Vaughan to the work of the surrealists like Marcel Duchamp and Salvador Dali, to the grandiose work of the pop artist Robert Rauschenberg, to the delicate animations by the Quay brothers, illustration, and to the idea that collage and chaos could both speak louder than precision and Bauhaus-style uniformity any day. For designer Graham Wood, it was all about letting your imagination run wild.
It's about the sort of freedom, that sense of letting things be what they want to be and take on their own life, and discovering through the detours of art the things that make the heart open.
From that point on, Vaughan came to realize the language of his art was never going to be in the rigor of life drawing or the conventions of color theory or leveraging typical visual tropes. Dowling's mantra sent him on a different path, filled with abstract textures, multiple layers of type and imagery, filled with questions and so much uncertainty. For artist and designer Paul West, it spoke to something almost poetic, musical.
I can remember seeing Vaughan's very early scrapbooks, and the typography's all there. You know, this is things I think in like Newcastle, he would collect ephemera, he would collect all these things. He fused his typography and his choice of imagery so well that it could only have come from this lyrical sensibility, really.
For Oliver, Dowling's philosophy ignited a profound awakening, opening up his mind to a deep love for finding the extraordinary in the everyday, to an intoxicating love of inky veneers, the seductive tingle you felt in your fingertips when pulp and fiber and image and sound all came together in a climatic surprise. From the very start, as Oliver explains in audio from 1984, he wanted to make something that couldn't be explained. His instinct was only ever to evoke.
It's in the form of packaging. Cynically, it's packaging of a product. But I think we've got a lot more opportunity in this to do something that's more sympathetic with the product and more sympathetic to the music.
He wanted to make something that couldn't be explained. His instinct was only ever to evoke. In the next few weeks, we will be launching a brand new season called Voices of Protest. It's going to be a little different, but we have a really great lineup of really interesting guests. Follow us on Instagram at Destroy Punk Podcast for more details. Now back to the show. As post-punk ricocheted through England during the early 1980s, London became the gravitational centre for every young artist chasing a dream. It was the country's throbbing centre of creativity, street style, and the hedonistic new music scenes, new wave, synth pop, shoulder pads, big hair. English society was on an upward swing, and Vaughan Oliver followed its draft. Graduating in 1979, he headed south. Stepping off the train at London's King's Cross, he arrived in the capital with hopes and desires of his own. With nothing more than a portfolio under his arm, he went in search of a home. a creative home that would celebrate his passion for abstract poetry and chaotic, ethereal beauty, one that would celebrate Dowling's described, suggest philosophy that he loved so much. He was excited, hopeful. London was, after all, celebrating its creative prowess, especially with the likes of Peter Saville and Malcolm Garrett and his friend Neville Brody all capitalizing on the city's newfound prosperity, and music, his true love, was the driver. Record sleeves were fast becoming the windows into new music, as Paul West explains.
All the way through the whole punk explosion into new wave, of course, the sleeves were such vanguards of the music. But it's just not the process of absorbing the front cover. It's looking at the on bodies and the labels and just seeing this incredible language.
And Vaughan was ready to capitalize on this new sonic explosion, but it wasn't a straight line getting there. Dewy-eyed, he took a job at the distinguished Michael Peters and Partners, who, according to some, were considered one of the most reputable and prestigious design firms in the country. They were responsible for the groundbreaking packaging for brands like Heinz and Winsor & Newton, or so he was told. For any recent graduate, it was a plum job, especially one far away from home. It was also steady work, very polished, very tidy, very nice, but very obvious, very corporate, and very, very predictable. His mother and father no doubt saw it as a success. He hated it. Creativity at MPP, unlike the work of his heroes like David Lynch and Werner Herzog, followed three simple priorities: deadlines, clients, and rational outcomes. That was all. For Oliver, it meant nothing. A far cry from those rain-soaked days spent swooning over Yes covers and Roger Dean artwork at his local Woolies. According to Oliver, it was the disposable nature of the work he despised most. In audio captured in the early 80s, he explains why.
I worked for a mainstream packaging design group that had a name and would work on something like a baked bean pad for a baked bean chain, to work on that for 9 months, and nobody recognized the difference between the previous pack. I mean, it's a much more subtle approach.
Imagining a future filled with baked bean tins, he found the tedium of working on something over and over again futile. The lack of creativity was stifling.
I didn't like the idea of working on something for 9 months and then people putting it in the dustbin.
For young and ambitious Oliver, his work wasn't garbage. His work was to be cherished, loved. He longed to get work in the blossoming music industry. He wanted to chase his imagination, to find somewhere he could design with emotion, not for commerce or some asinine customer focus group. It was about creating something much more personal.
I like the idea of people taking a record sleeve home to find out a little bit more inside on the inner sleeve, and then on the label, then on the front and the back.
He wanted a way out of MPP fast. He wanted to keep moving his creativity forward, discover like-minded souls. Fortuitously, a door opened at 4AD. 4AD was a different kind of record label that was quietly taking shape on Alma Road in Wandsworth, a neglected part of southwest London where someone else was thinking it was also time to get out. Ivo Watts Russell, a softly spoken former A&R man at Beggar's Banquet, had grown disillusioned with the business-as-usual nature of the bloated record industry. He dreamed of something more poetic, less product-focused, more driven by feelings and intuition, somewhere for artists to experiment and shine, somewhere that believed as he did in releasing a record for a record's sake. In 1980, he founded 4AD, a label that would become a sanctuary for the strange, the beautiful, and oftentimes challenging music that provoked the status quo, prevalent in the music charts of the day. Randomly, Ivo and Vaughan both found themselves at the same hedonistic party thrown by an aspiring post-punk upstart. For Watts Russell and Oliver, it was a collision of hedonism that would cement a fertile symbiotic relationship from that day forth. Oliver, never typically one to brag, described the moment in succinct brevity. I was lucky, we got on very well. He valued the importance of record sleeves too. It was the beginning, the start of it all. By 1982, Vaughan Oliver had joined 4AD as its first full-time employee, and with him came his friend and former classmate, Nigel Grierson. Setting up shop in the corner of the box-strewn offices at 4AD at Alma Road, Grierson and Oliver created a haven for themselves, a place where musicians and artists of any stripe could feel welcome to pop by and collaborate on Oliver and Grierson's ideas in real time. They called themselves 23 Envelope, a name that meant nothing and everything, all at the same time. It was a cipher, a puzzle, an invitation to want to know more. It quickly became code for originality, innovation, and cherished individualism. Paul West recalls how 23 Envelope's enigmatic identity filled him with intrigue.
All I can remember is just suddenly seeing this strange 23E logo alongside 4AD, thinking, this is like some incredible pact. What's going on? And I just had to find more of it. I just had to get into it.
For Ivo Watts Russell, it was a special place. One where the packaging and the music were fully intertwined. In audio from the early 80s, he lays out his vision for wanting to not be seen as part of the established music scene.
It's important that people who have associated 23 Envelope with 4AD, with certain groups, that they see this continuity, this progression going on, and that it is still so vastly different from the mainstream.
From the start, the studio operated unlike anywhere else. Mickey Berenyi, whose band Lush signed to 4AD a few years later, saw it as a privileged opportunity, founded on a creative desire to create something unique.
Ivo was totally empathetic to Vaughan and totally admired his work. It was an incredible freedom for Vaughan to do whatever he wanted, and it's quite intellectual that you almost don't need the band title, because once Vaughan comes up with a sleeve, it is in itself so different to everything else that it is instantly recognisable.
There were no briefs, no marketing teams, and Ivo trusted Grierson and Oliver implicitly. The creative choices they made, the musical signings they helped scrutinise, and the elaborate concepts, it all. It wasn't about creating obscure visual references. It was about something deeper. In archival audio, Nigel Grierson elaborates.
I think there's quite a difference between the words pretentious and precious. But if you look at the finished sleeves, to me, the preciousness implies some kind of more analytical, logical series of steps rather than a kind of intuitive, spontaneous approach.
As Ivo explained in an interview at the time, their obsessive nature reflected my fanatical fascination for the music perfectly, and buying a 4AD record became about more than simply wanting to hear the music. It was about wanting to enter the universe that everyone, and most importantly, the artist had created. For Mickey Berenyi, the symbiotic relationship was monumental.
Vaughan was completely key to 4AD, and Ivo has talked at great length about how the records, they were artifacts, and the artwork was very much a part of that.
In an industry filled with countless sycophants and bottom feeders, the freedom they had was rare, and it allowed Oliver and Grierson to create ideas built on atypical ideals.
The temptation always is with marketing women in music is to exploit their attractiveness. But I think for us in particular, the idea of being on 4AD with these amazing sleeves, it's a label that doesn't exploit you in the way that a major label would, and being able to sidestep that process, you don't have to be part of the marketing, as it were, was really liberating.
In audio from the early 80s, Oliver also points to his process as being key to the label's success.
We always try to push things that something's going to be more true to the product, to the record, to the music. It's enough to intrigue, to want to take it home, to find out a little bit more inside, on the inner sleeve, and then on the label. We never approach things from that angle. We never consider creative ideas pushed to one side for the sake of the one that would sell.
From the outside, 4AD was an unglamorous, nondescript warehouse-like concrete slab, but the Pilgrims were never there for the glamour. They were there for their hero, to learn where his ideas came from, a glimpse into reality to understand. Graham Wood, who was an early disciple, was mesmerized.
It was like when I went to 4AD, I was like, that's so strange. It's not in Soho, it's not in the middle of everywhere with everyone hanging out, doing stuff. It was a very insular thing, you know. It was like their own little gang.
For Nigel Grierson, they were often developing intuitive manifestations of songs, which often had ambiguous, intangible meanings.
I think the most important thing about our approach to record covers is that, and the most unique thing really, is that we try to achieve an image quality which is more abstract and closer to the feeling of the music, to capture the atmosphere and the more formal aspects of the music.
Grierson and Oliver's images were like poetic puzzles, composed of fragments of glass, gauze, steam rising from a lake, faces submerged in a blur, half seen, half familiar, half perceptible, a reverberation of sound, silence, and abstract extremes. It was an approach to design built on suggestion and seduction, never to describe, only to enjoy. Each new project was an act of trust, of letting go. They welcomed errors, chased every accident, as Cocteau Twins bass player and founder of Bella Union Records, Simon Raymond, remembers well.
He just looked at the ugly side of things, or the beautiful side of things, as a sort of counterpoint to whatever the music was like. Somebody that just looks at something and goes, "It looks brilliant. I'm using it." And I think we were very much like that with music.
Nothing was formally composed. Ideas were always unearthed, attended to with love and care, stumbled upon in the darkness, an overexposed print, a reflection bounced off the wall. For Chris Bigg, who joined 23 Envelope straight from college, the studio environment was invigorating.
We had a big wall in the studio, not a big wall, but we'd pin things up. And you'd hear Ivo would say, "We've got this band, his name's Alive, thinking of doing the album in October. Maybe get some ideas together, listen to the music." So there was always this churn of demos, bands coming in. That was the beauty of it. That was the best time, because I felt like I was involved in something bigger than just being a graphic designer.
The studio was also working with PMTs, or photo-mechanical transfer cameras, building collages of found object, distorted slides, resulting in long, hot-tempered hours in the darkroom under bright lights and the odor of sulfates. Tim O'Donnell remembers how he and Vaughan leaned into their technical failings.
A lot of the textural stuff, mostly it was PMTs done wrong, because I didn't know how to operate the things. But it was a lot of peeling apart the papers before they were fully exposed, that there'd be something in them that was really interesting and we would run with it. If something comes out by mistake, doesn't mean that it's wrong.
For Jonathan Barnbrook, the technique was revolutionary.
The way he creatively used the darkroom, where he used a PMT camera, a photo-mechanical transfer camera. I've never seen that aesthetic. It just was a level above everybody else.
For author and designer Adrian Shaughnessy, who published a book of Oliver's entire archive in 2018, titled VO Archive, which included many of his original PMT images, Shaughnessy found Oliver's approach to image making way ahead of its time.
You can look at half a dozen Vaughan sleeves, and he uses the baseboard of the PMT cameras. He'd used it just like later generations came to use Photoshop.
It was a physicality Vaughan held onto, even as the design world around him started to embrace digital design, something that for him was an anathema. Yet many of those who worked with him understood it was not part of how his ideas took shape, even though eventually he knew he had to embrace the technology's rapid invasion.
Vaughan Oliver resisted the computer most of his life, really. I think he was the last, not music designer, the last designer in London to actually give over and say, okay, we've got to do it.
He steadfastly refused to go that way. For many years, he just said, no, that's not how I can work. I have to see it on a board, and I have to move things around physically to see how it works.
I understand. Like it's at a remove from cutting something on a scalpel and pasting it down and sizing it just based on what feels right, as opposed to we have to choose a number.
You know, our whole lives are these days dictated by this screen, and it's not having any perspective anymore. We can't sort of match one thing with another on an iPhone.
He really struggled with it for a long time. It was hard for it to make mistakes. He hated it. He hated it. He really hated it. It felt far away. It was like swimming with Wellington boots on.
For Simon Raymond, Oliver's more emotional approach also illustrated why using a computer didn't make sense for him.
He would listen to the music over and over again, just close his eyes and just imagine stuff. What can I see here? What can I imagine? Even if it had nothing to do with anything in particular, that's how he would come up with his ideas. And I think that's the beauty of it. It wasn't inspired by anything for him other than listening to the music.
4AD was the perfect home to 23 Envelope's singular approach, driven by instinct and trust and an ability to imagine. In archival audio from 1984, Oliver and Grierson outlined their distinct approach.
I mean, it's almost like one person coming up with the same ideas. He'll have ideas about the design, the typography. I'll have ideas about the photography. A lot of the things we like to try couldn't actually be explained in a little thumbnail sketch or in words initially anyway. That's why we're lucky here and that the bands do, in fact, rely heavily on sort of fate.
For some bands, the label's look seemed to overshadow their own identity, but for bands like Lush, working with Oliver was a dream come true.
What I remember is going in and meeting Vaughan, being quite cowed. He wasn't what I expected, but I had no idea how record companies work. I just thought they'd probably have this library of amazing images. So having Vaughan actually listen to the music and talk about the music and then relate it to the visuals was a bit mind-blowing. I felt like a total imposter syndrome because it just seemed ridiculous that this guy whose sleeves I'd had adorning my bedroom for several years was actually paying attention to our crappy songs.
23 Envelope's intuitively driven work also often led to very specific ideas. It was never about choices. You just got a sleeve by the great Vaughan Oliver, as Simon Raymond remembers clearly when they worked together years later on covers for Bella Union.
You might be sat at home thinking, what's he doing? How long does it take to come up with something? But it's not like other designers who'll do 4 or 5 ideas and put them on an email and just go, I've got this, and if you don't like that, I've got this. He would just do the one idea, but when he presented the one to you, it was so sophisticated and so in-depth as to all the layers and the explanations of why this is like that, and that has to be the flip side of that, and that's going to go there. He came with a thesis about why this idea was absolutely the one, and I guess that's the mark of the man.
Oliver was not a salesman either, but his singular vision meant he was very adept at convincing others to come around to his way of thinking, even when there were seeds of doubt, as Raymond recalls when Oliver designed the cover for I Break Horses.
My initial thought was that it was just a bit too literal, because the band was called I Break Horses and he was using horses, and I just thought, I don't know, this is a bit easy. But when I saw what he'd done, I was like, oh, okay, that is absolutely incredible. And the artist loved it as well. And her first EP and her first album are really iconic. They're absolutely magnificent.
It was a formula Oliver had nurtured early on and one key to 4AD's success. By the mid-80s, 23 Envelope had become as important to the label's identity as the musicians to its reputation. The art and the sound were inseparable. You could recognize a 4AD release from across the room. For designer Jonathan Barnbrook, who had worked with David Bowie, he saw the label's singular vision as a win-win for all. It was a trifecta of odds in his mind.
I don't even know what the artists thought about record covers. Obviously, some of them loved them, but I'm pretty sure it worked as a thing for selling the album as well. There was a following that bought them specifically because it was Vaughan, which is a very unique position for a record company. So there's parameters, company getting freedom, a really good designer, and a following and an audience which is over and above just the music. It's pretty unique.
Consequently, music fans and design students like myself began turning up at the studio's door in their droves, hoping to take away something mythical. They were disciples in search of their messiah, the creative genius, their god, and who usually left in disbelief that their chosen one had made time for them. For many of them, like Paul West, Graham Wood, Chris Bick, and others, They were on a spiritual journey in search of their destiny.
So I ended up doing graphic design almost because I didn't really know anything about it. And everybody started talking about 23 envelope.
By the end of the first year, that's when Vaughan's influence became much more of a thing. And it was particularly his typography.
And I got in contact with him to write my dissertation about him. And Vaughan wrote a lovely letter saying, very excited that someone is taking us seriously. Please come to Alma Road.
I remember walking in and just this great big shaven-headed, clad in black guy meeting me, and just really gentle giant.
So I rang Vaughan. He said, come and see me. And he took my first year portfolio. He was generally scathing, but encouraged me and picked up on the things that he liked, or textures and use of typography and all that sort of stuff.
I graduated. He then came down to Brighton to see my degree show, which I was really chuffed with. And he wrote a lovely little thing in my little notebook, please show some more in SW18.
And I took along one of these tiny little tape recorders there, and he said, anyway, before you go, you'll be wanting a couple of these. And he just took me downstairs, and I couldn't quite believe it. To leave such hallowed offices and with more vinyl than you can actually shake a stick at.
He was very nice, very, very good to me.
To be in that environment and to be walking out with these objects of beauty was absolutely phenomenal.
The designer Vaughan Oliver lived his whole life in the service of others. Yet despite his relentless passion and heartfelt dedication, his rapid rise to fame did not always lead him down easy roads. In our next episode, part 2 of our story about one of England's most important artists, we learn more about his singular vision, how a band from Boston would catapult him into the stratosphere of alternative rock, how fans flocked from all over Europe to worship his work, and we hear more from those who adored him. We also learn that despite the recognition and the fame, the Grammy Awards, exhibitions in Tokyo and Paris, his way forward was not that simple. You can listen to part 2 now as we continue to unravel and rewind Vaughan Oliver's story. This episode of Destroy was written and produced by Be Right Back Studios with the generous support of Lee Widows. A special thanks to everyone who shared their time, their memories, and their love for Vaughan. Music for this episode was composed by Tokyo Iconic. To see some of the artwork mentioned in this show, as well as music videos and archival interviews, please visit destroypunkpodcast.com. You can also support our show via Patreon or follow us on Instagram at Destroy Punk Podcast, or simply share this episode with someone who still believes in the tactile and the oblique. This has been another episode of Destroy. Thank you for listening, and thank you, Vaughan, for everything. My name is Richard Smith, and I'm your host. I'm a filmmaker and art director, and once upon a time I was part of the big 80s. I designed record covers for Depeche Mode, I danced with Bono, discussed art with Mick Jagger, and drank tea with Susie Sue. I also grew up during those turbulent times in England in the late 70s and was driven by the do-it-yourself ethos of punk. I obsessed over bands like Joy Division and New Order and went on to work for the album cover designer Peter Saville. I believe that year, that moment in 1976, when a bunch of foul-mouthed yobs cursed and swore on national television, changed the future of culture forever, and is what brought us to where we are today. So where do we go from here? Will emerging new technologies be the catalyst that tears down the walls of mediocrity, throwing culture and society into chaos and revolution again? We'll have to wait and see. Destroy is a Be Right Back Studios production. Learn more at BeRightBackStudios.com. And please tune in again for another episode of Destroy, the Influence of Punk podcast, wherever you listen or download. Be right back. The archival audio used in this episode of Destroy is taken from a variety of unknown sources. Every effort has been made to use these clips responsibly, concerning their original creators for the purpose of education, commentary, and tribute. All rights remain with the original rights holders.